It was the kind of August afternoon Arizona is famous for. Air so still the heat feels suspended, like the whole desert is holding its breath. Park rangers Marcus Chen and Diana Ortega were finishing a quiet patrol through one of the remote back routes near Sedona, the kind tourists rarely find and locals respect enough not to disturb. They walked in practiced silence until Diana froze mid-step. "Marcus?" she murmured, pointing toward a bend in the sandstone. At first glance, the shape tucked between a cluster of junipers looked like nothing more than rock, a trick of shadow and rust-colored earth. But then the outline sharpened into something unmistakably human. Someone was sitting there, perfectly still, too still. Marcus felt a cold prickle run down his spine. People didn't sit like that out here, not in the heat, not in silence, not without reason. They moved closer, boots crunching over brittle ground. The figure was hunched over, knees drawn tight to the chest, arms locked around them. Clothes hung off the body like faded rags, what might once have been light hiking gear, now torn, sun-bleached, and stained the color of the canyon floor. Every bone seemed visible beneath skin stretched impossibly thin. Diana's voice echoed softly. "Ma'am? Ma'am, can you hear me?" No movement. Marcus lifted his radio, thumb trembling over the button. "Dispatch, this is Unit 5. We need medical immediately. Possible critical. Sending coordinates now." As he spoke, Diana knelt beside the woman. The closer she got, the worse it looked. The woman's hair was matted, tangled, fused in clumps as if untouched for months. Her hands, what was left of them, were covered in deep, crisscrossed scars, grooves etched so long they'd risen like pale ridges. When Diana gently brushed the woman's shoulder, the figure lifted her head. The motion was slow, mechanical, like a puppet being pulled upright for the first time. Her eyes met Diana's, and Diana's breath caught in her throat. Those eyes weren't afraid, or relieved, or even aware. They were empty, hollow in a way no living eyes should be, as if whatever had once lived behind them had fled long ago, leaving only a shell behind, Marcus whispered. Dear God. There was no ID, no pack, no phone, not even a scrap of gear, just boots with soles peeling apart and clothes that looked a decade older than the woman herself. The helicopter arrived within the half hour, rotors whipping the red dust into a frenzy. Paramedics approached with the kind of urgency that comes only with true dread. One medic, a man who'd seen more wilderness injuries than most, muttered to Marcus, "I don't know how she's still conscious." They loaded her up, strapped an IV into fragile veins that seemed ready to collapse, wrapped her in heat blankets, though the desert was boiling. Through it all, the woman didn't speak, not a word, not a sound. She only stared upward, blinking slowly, like each movement cost her something. That night, at Flagstaff Medical Center, a nurse named Carla Reyes cleaned dried dirt from the woman's shoulder and paused. A birthmark? Small? Distinct? She had seen it before. Carla hurried to her computer, pulled up the database, typed a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. A missing woman. Vanished 3 summers ago. A case that had haunted half the county. The picture loaded. A smiling, healthy woman with bright dark eyes and hair tied back in a neat ponytail. Carla's hand went to her mouth. The woman in the bed looked nothing like the photograph, but the birthmark didn't lie. She whispered, "Natalie Holloway?" By afternoon, news reached the Coconino County Sheriff's Office. Detective Raymond Torres, a man who carried the weight of cold cases the way some people carry old injuries, heard the dispatcher say the name and felt everything inside him go still. Natalie Holloway. Missing for 3 years, thought by many to be dead. Found alive. Torres was on the road before he knew he'd stood up. The drive to Flagstaff blurred past, pine forests, sun-baked highway, canyon walls flashing like memories in motion. He had lived with this case, the unanswered questions, the map pinned with fruitless search grids, the photo of Natalie taped to his desk like a promise he hadn't kept. He replayed it all in his mind. June 22nd, 2015. Natalie signs into a Sedona trailhead for a simple day hike. Never comes home. Her car waiting, her phone dead, her trail disappearing into nothing. They had combed miles of wilderness, hundreds of volunteers, dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging. Nothing. It was as if the desert had opened its jaws and swallowed her whole. When Torres stepped into her hospital room, he stopped in the doorway. The woman in the bed looked impossibly small, a thin silhouette under white sheets. Her cheeks were carved into sharp angles, her collarbones jutting like fragile branches. She stared upward without blinking, as if her eyes were fixed on something far beyond the ceiling. "Miss Holloway," he whispered. No reaction. He sat beside her, feeling strangely afraid to breathe too loud. In her presence, silence felt like something living. He talked anyway, carefully, gently. He told her she was safe, that she was found, that her mother and friends were coming. Her gaze shifted, just barely, toward him. It was the only acknowledgement she gave, but to Torres, it felt like the first crack in a sealed door. As he walked out, one question echoed through him louder than any desert canyon. Where had Natalie Holloway been for 3 years? And what had happened to her out there? Natalie Holloway had always been the kind of person who slipped quietly out of crowded rooms when the noise grew too loud. Her friends knew it, her family accepted it, and her roommate, Melissa Vance, a graduate student with a gift for reading people, learned early on that when Natalie said she needed a day to herself, she meant it. Teaching 4th grade at Ponderosa Elementary wasn't just a job for Natalie. It was a constant outpouring of energy. 28 kids with questions, fears, tears, jokes, lost homework, scraped knees, and stories about the pets they adored. She loved them, but each school year left her drained in a way she never quite knew how to explain. By June of 2015, Natalie was tired down to the bone. The kind of tired people don't notice when you smile through it. One quiet night, she sat at the small kitchen table of the apartment she shared with Melissa. A trail map was spread in front of her, the canyons and ridges of the Sedona backcountry marked with loops of neon yellow highlighter. She traced a familiar trail with her finger. She'd hiked it twice before. Moderate difficulty, gorgeous views. Perfect for a reset. Melissa entered the kitchen in her oversized Phoenix Suns sweatshirt, tea steaming in her hands. She glanced at the map and frowned in that half-worried, half-annoyed way she always did when Natalie planned a solo trek. "You're going alone again?" Natalie smiled. "It's 1 day. I'll text you when I get there, and when I'm heading back." "You better text me," Melissa said, trying for humor but not quite landing it. Natalie underlined her reassurance with a grin. "Dinner, remember? I'll be back by dinner." That night, she packed her day pack with near ritual precision. 2 liters of water, a first aid kit, sunscreen, trail mix, protein bars, an apple, rain jacket, fully charged phone, lightweight hat. Every item exactly where she was used to finding it. She slept well. No dreams she remembered, just the comfort of knowing she'd wake to a quiet day in the desert. At dawn, she dressed in moisture-wicking layers, braided her hair tight, scribbled a note from Melissa, "Be back tonight, don't eat all the ice cream," and stepped out into the warm June morning. The drive from Flagstaff to Sedona unfolded like a meditation. Pine forest gave way to the high desert's wide-open breath. The rising sun struck the red rock formations until they glowed like embers beneath a new sky. She parked at the trailhead just after 8. The gravel lot was small, only 2 other cars tucked beneath the shade of a rock outcropping. She texted Melissa, "Here, starting hike, dinner tonight." 3 simple words that would later haunt them both. She signed the trail register with the tidy handwriting of a person who cared about small things. June 22nd, 2015. Natalie Holloway, Red Ridge Loop. Estimated return, 3 p.m. And then she stepped onto the trail. The first mile passed easily, the air still cool, the scent of juniper drifting through the canyon. Natalie fell into rhythm, her boots crunching over stone, her breath steady, her mind beginning to unfurl from all the noise it had carried. A couple with trekking poles passed her going the opposite way. They exchanged cheerful good mornings, the kind hikers offer like currency of goodwill. Natalie kept going. The trail climbed, switchbacking up the ridge. She paused occasionally to take in the view. Layer after layer of red rock formations, carved by countless years of wind and water. She snapped a picture on her phone, sent it to her mother with the caption, "Wish you were here." Her mother replied almost instantly, "Beautiful. Be safe, sweetheart." Around midday, she stopped at a flat rock outcrop to eat. She sat cross-legged, back against the warm stone, listening to the desert's soft rustle. A hush that felt ancient. After 20 minutes, she slung her pack over her shoulder and followed the descent into a narrow canyon. The sunlight dimmed as steep sandstone walls rose on either side. She'd walked this shaded pass before. She knew it well, 1/2 mile. Then the canyon widened again. Easy, but before she made it even 100 yards into the narrow pass, she heard it. Her name. So faint at first, she thought it was a trick of stone and wind. "Natalie." She stopped, turned. The canyon behind her was empty. "Hello?" she called. "Is someone there?" Silence. She waited. Her heart thumped harder, but she breathed slow, reminding herself sound traveled strangely here. She took another step. Then the voice came again, louder this time, echoing off the rock walls, distorted, as if coming not from ahead, but from above. "Natalie." She pivoted, scanning the ridge high overhead. Her pulse began to climb. Not quite fear, not yet, but a sharp, instinctive alertness. "Do you need help?" she called out. No answer. Just that heavy canyon silence. Natalie swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry, and turned to continue down the path. She never made it 2 steps. From behind her, from impossibly close, warm breath brushed the back of her neck. A hand clamped over her mouth. She barely had time to gasp before the world around her snapped into a blur of terror. Back in Flagstaff, Melissa didn't worry at first. Not really. Natalie lost track of time sometimes. She wandered off to get coffee after hikes. She stopped at scenic overlooks and watched the sunset. By 7 p.m., that calm dissolved. Natalie was 4 hours late. Melissa called her phone, straight to voicemail. Called again, and again. By 8 o'clock, she paced the apartment, checking her phone every 30 seconds, staring out the window as though Natalie would appear in the parking lot like nothing was wrong. At 9:15, panic finally overpowered hope. Melissa called Natalie's mother, Carol Holloway. Carol listened, voice steady but strained, and when Melissa said Natalie still hadn't checked in, something hardened in the silence between them. 10 minutes later, Carol called the sheriff's office. The deputy who answered was polite, calm, too calm for Carol's racing heartbeat. He said they'd send someone to check the trailhead, that adults often misjudge time in the backcountry, that most missing hikers turned up within a day. But Carol Holloway didn't sleep that night. She didn't even sit down. She drove 2 hours north, headlights cutting through desert blackness, her mind replaying every warning she had ever given her daughter about hiking alone. By sunrise, officers found Natalie's car, exactly where she left it. Locked, untouched, purse inside, water bottle still half full, no Natalie. and the day that changed everything quietly began. By 8 a.m., the trailhead was swarming with motion. Park rangers pulling maps onto portable tables, search and rescue volunteers checking radios and water packs, the low thrum of a helicopter warming up in the distance. The morning sun hadn't yet burned off the chill, but the air was already thick with urgency. Detective Raymond Torres arrived just as the first search teams were gathering. He scanned the group and saw Carol Holloway standing rigidly beside Melissa, both of them pale from exhaustion but refusing to leave. Torres approached with a quiet nod. "We'll find her," he told them. It wasn't a promise. He never made promises in the field, but it was something close. The search began where Natalie's clear, neat handwriting appeared in the trail register. From there, the volunteers fanned out along the Red Ridge Loop. Dogs sniffed at the dust, noses low. Rangers checked side paths, rockshell, dry washes. Torres walked the trail himself, picturing Natalie's steps. The first mile matched exactly what hikers had reported. A couple confirmed they passed her around 9:30. She was alone, calm, hiking with an easy pace. After that, nothing. Somewhere between the first ridge and the narrowing canyon, Natalie had vanished. The search dogs caught her scent on the main trail and followed it for nearly 3 miles. Then the scent evaporated in a rocky corridor where the canyon walls closed tight. The dogs circled, pulled, whined. Nothing. It was as if Natalie had stepped off the earth. Torres felt the familiar frustration rising. Searches like this rarely offered clarity, only questions layered over more questions. By midday, a helicopter swept overhead, thermal cameras scanning for heat signatures. It found deer, a lone hiker, a patch of sun-warmed rock, but not Natalie. Rescue crews covered 12 square miles that first day, another 8 the next. Volunteers walked until their voices cracked from calling her name. They found no torn clothing, no gear, no shoe prints, no sign of a struggle. Not a single piece of her. Each night, Carol stayed at the command post long after the volunteers went home. She brought coffee and sandwiches to the exhausted teams. She thanked everyone 100 times. She refused to sit. Melissa stayed by her side, guilt gnawing at her the way fear gnaws at bone. On day 3, Torres interviewed everyone who'd been on the trail that morning. Park rangers, hikers, maintenance workers clearing brush miles away. Nothing stood out. No suspicious vehicles, no odd behavior. Around noon, he stood in the canyon where Natalie's scent had gone cold. The rock walls rose high and jagged, and the space narrowed enough that 2 hikers couldn't walk side by side. "This is where she disappeared," he whispered to himself. There were only 3 possibilities. She fell, but there were no drop-offs nearby, no crevices deep enough to hide a body. She walked off voluntarily, but leaving the trail would have required climbing or crossing difficult ground, and our tracks would have shown it. Or someone had taken her and done it cleanly. He didn't like the third possibility, but it hovered at the edge of his thoughts like a shadow that refused to disappear. By the 4th day, the search expanded to include technical teams rappelling into slot canyons and climbing narrow ledges. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning ridges nobody could reach on foot. Still nothing. After 2 weeks of searching, the official operation began to wind down. The incident commander, a ranger who had coordinated dozens of similar cases, approached Carol with eyes full of sorrow. "We've covered every probable area," he said softly. "If she were here, we would have found something by now." What he didn't say was louder than the words he chose. People lost in the wilderness are usually found, one way or another, within the first 72 hours. This was day 14. But Carol Holloway refused to surrender. She contacted a private search and rescue nonprofit, specialists known for pushing farther than official crews could justify. They brought new dogs, new equipment, and a fresh determination. They searched 8 more days. Nothing. No Natalie, no evidence, not even a suggestion of where she could have gone. By the end of July, Natalie's disappearance became a cold case. Torres took the file back to his office and set it in front of him. He stared at her photograph, Natalie in a classroom, smiling gently as if the world had never offered her anything but kindness. He kept her photo on his desk for 3 years. Some chases fade from memory, hers never did. The morning 2 park rangers found Natalie 3 years and 2 months later sent shockwaves through the entire county. In the ICU of Flagstaff Medical Center, doctors hovered around her in hushed, urgent tones. Dr. Michael Arno, the attending physician, reviewed her vitals with a tight jaw. Severe malnutrition, life-threatening dehydration, electrolytes so low it was a miracle she hadn't collapsed on the spot. Evidence of old fractures, improperly healed wrist and ankle, dental trauma, calloused feet thick enough to resemble hardened bark. But the most alarming part wasn't her physical state. It was the absence in her eyes, a vacant, deep silence that suggested the mind had taken refuge somewhere unreachable, a place built to survive what reality could not. On day 4, when she was moved from ICU to a private room, Carol arrived. She stood in the doorway for several seconds, trembling, not from fear, but disbelief. The woman in the bed looked like a ghost wearing Natalie's skin. Her arms were so thin Carol was afraid they'd break at a touch. Her hair was tangled in dark knots. Her face was hollow, lips cracked, skin stretched taut over bone. But it was her. Carol approached slowly. "Natalie, sweetheart." Natalie didn't respond. She stared ahead, breathing shallowly. Carol sat beside her and took her hand, cold, frail, unfamiliar. A nurse whispered, "She hasn't spoken at all." Carol swallowed hard. "Is she aware?" "We think so. She reacts to sound, touch, but mentally she's somewhere else." Somewhere Carol couldn't reach. Torres visited next. When he walked into the dimly lit room, he felt the world narrow to the sound of Natalie's thin breaths. He sat beside her just as Carol had. "Natalie," he said quietly, "my name is Detective Torres. I've been working your case for a long time." No reaction. He tried again, softer. "You're safe now." Finally, so faint he almost missed it, her eyes shifted towards him, not recognition, just acknowledgement, like a moth turning toward a distant flame. Torres leaned forward, heart pounding. He needed answers. The whole county needed answers. But as he watched her stare past him into some unseen distance, he realized the truth. Whatever happened to Natalie Holloway, she wasn't ready to speak of it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the wilderness had secrets, and Torres intended to dig until every one of them surfaced. The wilderness does not give up its secrets easily, but it always leaves traces. On the morning after Natalie stabilized enough to remain conscious for longer stretches, Detective Raymond Torres led a forensic team back into the Sedona backcountry. He wanted to see, firsthand, the place where Natalie had been found. 9 miles from the original trailhead, deeper than most hikers ever dared to go, the desert opened into a secluded basin hidden behind red rock walls. A cluster of junipers stood at its center, scrub trees bent by years of harsh winds, and beneath one of those trees was the spot. Torres felt the air shift as he stepped into the clearing, as if the desert itself recognized the gravity of what had happened here. The ground beneath the tree was unnaturally flat, the soil compacted by someone who had sat there day after day, season after season. Dr. Sarah Keene, a forensic anthropologist, crouched beside the impression. "Someone stayed here a long time," she murmured. "Months, probably years." Torres scanned the area. "Natalie stayed here?" Dr. Keene shook her head. "Not alone." Those 3 words sank into Torres like stones. Nearby, an evidence technician sifted through a primitive fire ring.
stones placed deliberately in a circle, blackened with layers of ash. The ashes were deep, compacted, disturbed by countless fires. As she sifted, she pulled out charred bone fragments, rabbits, squirrels, small game, enough to feed one person, or two. Then she found something else, melted, warped pieces of plastic, bits of a water bottle, a food wrapper. Torres frowned. Someone brought packaged supplies out here. Or scavenged them, the technician replied. But Torres wasn't convinced. The nearest road was miles away. Whoever had lived out here had made repeated trips, either dragging Natalie with them or returning alone. He followed the botanist, Dr. Elena Ruiz, as she ducked behind a natural rock wall. What she revealed made Torres's stomach twist. A cultivated garden. Wild onions, edible tubers, prickly pear cactus carefully organized into neat clusters. The soil had been cleared of weeds and loosened as if tended by patient, deliberate hands. "This took time," Dr. Ruiz said quietly. "Years. Someone lived here, Detective. They didn't pass through. They settled." Torres looked at the little garden, his jaw tightening. "Natalie didn't do this." "No," Dr. Ruiz agreed. "This was someone who knew how to survive out here. Someone methodical." 50 yards beyond the garden, tucked into a shallow cave partially concealed by brush, they found something worse. A shelter. Pine needles and dried moss formed a makeshift bed. Pieces of torn fabric were scattered across the floor. Hair samples were collected. Some matched Natalie's, others didn't. The forensic team moved outside, and that's when Torres saw the tally marks. Hundreds of them, carved into the soft sandstone, grouped in fives, row after row.
Dr. Keene ran her hand gently over the markings. 952, she said, give or take a few faded ones. Torres's breath caught. 3 years. 3 years of counting days. Whether Natalie had carved them or someone else had, he didn't yet know, but the message was unmistakable. Someone had kept track. Someone had planned to stay. Someone believed this place mattered, and that someone was not there now. On the third day of the site analysis, a young evidence technician named Amy Cortez called out, urgency thick in her voice. "Detective, you need to see this." Torres hurried over. Beneath a flat slab of stone, hidden carefully out of sight, Amy had uncovered a small cache, a hunting knife, its blade worn but still sharp, a coil of paracord, and a notebook swollen from moisture. Torres crouched. "Bag it," he said. "Every page, every fiber." The notebook was taken straight to the lab, where a document specialist spent hours drying, photographing, and separating its fragile pages. A forensic linguist, Dr. Patricia Odom, was brought in to decipher the handwriting. Some entries were neat and controlled. Others spiraled into jagged, frantic scrawls that smeared the ink. The words chilled Torres to the bone. The writer referred to Natalie repeatedly as the teacher, the quiet one, the one who needed saving. One entry, dated roughly a week after her disappearance, read, "Found her near the ridge today. She tried to climb out, fell twice. I carried her back. She doesn't understand yet. The world out there broke her. I will show her peace." Another entry, "She's fighting too much. The world trained her to fear kindness. I have to keep her safe from herself." Another, "She tried to escape again. I had to hurt her. Not her fault. The world poisoned her mind, but she'll learn." At the bottom of most entries were 2 letters pressed hard into the paper. R.K. Torres's team combed databases, phone directories, DMV records, volunteer logs. Hours later, the initials matched a name that made Torres go cold. Ryan Keller. A wilderness guide, 34 years old, resident of Sedona at the time of Natalie's disappearance, and, most haunting of all, he had been a volunteer during the original search for Natalie. Torres pulled Keller's old interview transcript from 2015. At the time, Keller had been cooperative, articulate, even eager.
He talked about the wilderness like something sacred. He talked about Natalie like he knew her, though he didn't. He had stayed out longer than most volunteers, insisted the search teams were looking in the wrong places, claimed Natalie wouldn't stay near the main trail. In a few months after the search ended, Ryan Keller had abruptly left Sedona for Colorado. No forwarding address, no warning, just gone. Torres put out a statewide alert. Keller was now the sole person of interest in one of Arizona's darkest disappearances. 2 hours later, Torres got a hit, a traffic stop, 2 months earlier in Durango, Colorado. Keller had been pulled over for a busted taillight, given a warning, released, and now, once again, gone. A warrant was issued. Torres drove straight to Durango. When he arrived, Keller's apartment was empty, hastily abandoned, but what they found inside tore away any remaining illusion of misunderstanding or coincidence. In Keller's bedroom, taped to the wall in careful rows, were photographs. Dozens of them, all of Natalie. Some were clearly taken from her social media, but others were not. Natalie walking to her car, Natalie buying groceries, Natalie sitting alone outside her school grading papers, Natalie laughing with Melissa outside their apartment. He had been watching her, studying her, waiting for a moment when she was alone. The psychologist who reviewed the evidence called it a classic case of erotomania, a delusional obsession where the subject believes the victim is destined to be with them. He didn't kidnap her, the psychologist said quietly. In his mind, he saved her. Torres felt sick. Back in Flagstaff, Dr. Arnaud decided to try something delicate, something dangerous. He showed Natalie a photograph of Ryan Keller. Her reaction was instantaneous. Her breathing hitched, her hands curled into fists, her eyes widened with primal panic. And then, for the first time, Natalie spoke. A single word choked through trembling lips. "No!" Dr. Arnaud leaned in gently. "Natalie, who is he?" She swallowed hard, trembled, and whispered, "He's still out there." The room went silent. The air seemed to freeze, and Torres understood in that moment they weren't just uncovering a crime, they were racing against a man who believed the wilderness and Natalie's life belonged to him. Detective Raymond Torres didn't sleep after hearing Natalie's whispered warning. He didn't even sit down. He walked straight out of Flagstaff Medical Center, jaw tight, adrenaline pounding like a second heartbeat. If Natalie said he's still out there, then Ryan Keller wasn't just a fugitive. He was hunting. Within an hour, Keller's photograph appeared across every Arizona news station. The alert spread into neighboring states. Social media lit up with warnings and reposts. Armed and dangerous, Ryan Keller, person of interest in Natalie Holloway abduction. Tips poured in from Phoenix, from Albuquerque, from highway rest stops in Nevada. Dozens in the first 24 hours. Most were wrong. Some were hopeful guesses. A few were cruel hoaxes. Torres followed every lead anyway. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Keller remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks the same way Natalie had, unseen in a wilderness big enough to swallow whole towns. Then one cold September morning, everything changed. A lone hiker, an older man named Greg Jameson, was trekking through a remote patch of the Coconino National Forest, 60 miles north of Sedona, when he noticed something that didn't belong. A thin column of smoke curling upward behind a cluster of pines. The fire was small, recently extinguished. A tent stood nearby. A sleeping bag, still warm. Greg backed away slowly, heart pounding, and called 911. By afternoon, Torres was there, boots crunching over dead leaves, breath fogging in the early autumn chill. Rangers and deputies formed a perimeter as forensic teams documented the site. Inside the abandoned tent was a backpack containing a few clothes, a water filter, and twice now, in 2 different locations, the item Torres dreaded most, another notebook. Same brand, same careful handwriting. Same initials at the bottom of each entry, RK. The ink on the most recent pages was still wet. Torres slipped on gloves, carefully lifted the book, and read the latest passage aloud. They think they saved her. They think they took her away from peace, but she'll come back. She always will. No one understands what I did for her. I freed her from the world that used her and drained her. I protected her from the noise. Another entry, written the next day. She was meant for silence, and I gave it to her. I gave her truth. They stole her from it. Torres turned to the final page. 2 short sentences, written with eerie calm. I won't let them take me. I belong to the wilderness now. A shiver crawled down Torres's spine. We need teams sweeping the area now, he ordered. He's close. Search teams spread out in widening circles. The air smelled like pine and cold earth. The wilderness was quiet, too quiet. As dusk approached, a deputy called out from several hundred yards east of the campsite. Found something. Detective, you need to see this. Torres sprinted toward the voice. Under a massive ponderosa pine, slumped against the trunk as though simply resting, sat a man, Ryan Keller. His eyes were closed, his head tipped back slightly, his arms limp at his sides. At first glance, it looked peaceful, like a man enjoying the twilight, but the deputy's pale face told a different story. Torres knelt, touched Keller's neck. Cold. Still. Gone. An empty pill bottle lay beside him, a sedative strong enough to silence the body's will to breathe. Ryan Keller had taken his own life. No struggle, no hesitation, no final confrontation. Just an ending he controlled, like everything else he had tried to control. Torres exhaled slowly, a mixture of relief and bitterness burning through his chest. There would be no interrogation, no confession, no justice handed down in a courtroom. Just silence. The wilderness had claimed another secret. When Dr. Arno told Natalie that Keller was dead, she didn't break down. She didn't sigh with relief. She didn't even blink at first. She simply closed her eyes. Does that make you feel safer? Dr. Arno asked softly. Natalie swallowed, throat trembling with a barely contained emotion. No, she whispered. He waited. Natalie kept her gaze fixed on the window. The fear wasn't him, not just him. It's what he made me believe. Dr. Arno had treated trauma survivors for decades, but the hollowness in her voice was unlike anything he'd heard. He told me no one was coming, that no one remembered me, that the world forgot who I was. Carol sat beside her daughter, gripping her hand. He lied, sweetheart. We never stopped. I know, Natalie said quickly. I do. But knowing now doesn't change what I believed then, and believing it changes you. Over the next months, Natalie's body healed faster than her mind. The physical recovery was predictable, reintroducing nutrition in small amounts, rebuilding muscle through gentle therapy, stabilizing electrolytes, repairing damage from old fractures. But the psychological recovery, that was a maze. She met twice weekly with Dr. Benjamin Shaw, a trauma specialist with a calm voice and patient eyes. He didn't push, he never rushed her. He understood the mind's instinct to retreat after years of coercive control. Some days Natalie spoke for entire sessions, halting words spilling out like gravel. Other days she barely whispered a sentence. But slowly, painfully, she revealed fragments. The early days after Keller took her, blindfolded, disoriented, dragged through a twisting maze of canyons, the rough ground scraping her legs, the sun burning her skin, the confusion giving way to terror. Her escape attempts, 3 she remembered clearly, one that ended with a fall that fractured her wrist, another with an ankle twisted so badly she couldn't walk for days. Keller's voice, soft, steady, maddeningly calm, telling her she wasn't a prisoner, that he was keeping her safe from a world that didn't deserve her. He brought her water when she was too weak to search for it, cooked food over his fire, tended to her injuries, whispered that she needed him. "He made himself the only thing keeping me alive," she said once, her voice cracking. "And eventually, I believed him." Carol cried quietly beside her. Melissa cried in the hallway afterwards. Torres, when he later heard the details, had to step into his office and sit in silence for several minutes. "We can work through this," Dr. Shaw told her gently. "You survived something unimaginable, but you did survive." "Did I? Because sometimes I don't feel like the person who walked into that canyon. I feel like someone she became." Recovery was not linear. There were days when Natalie laughed, really laughed, and others when she stared at a wall, lost somewhere the present could not reach. When she was finally released from the hospital, she moved into her mother's home in Phoenix. A quiet room was set up for her, soft light, light blankets, nothing that resembled the wilderness. But nights were hard. Carol often found her awake at 3 a.m., sitting rigidly by the window, listening to phantom footsteps in the dark. "It's just the air conditioner, sweetheart," Carol whispered. Natalie nodded, but she wasn't convinced, because Keller had taught her something she didn't want to know. Silence can be dangerous, stillness can be a warning, and the wilderness doesn't need to touch you to haunt you. Detective Torres visited months later, not to ask questions, but to offer closure. "The case is officially closed," he told her gently. "Keller's death was ruled a suicide. All evidence has been cataloged. You won't have to see any of it unless you choose to." Natalie nodded. "Thank you." Torres studied her face, still thinner than before, but stronger now. Present, a survivor. "You fought," he said softly, "more than anyone will ever understand." Natalie looked down at her hands, the scars still visible. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then, "He didn't bury me. I'm still here." Torres felt something warm rise in his chest, something like pride. Natalie Holloway was beginning to return, piece by fragile piece.
By late winter of 2018, Natalie Holloway had regained enough physical strength to leave the hospital, but the world outside still felt too large, too loud to face alone. She moved into her mother's home in Phoenix, a quiet house with soft beige walls and sunlight that filtered gently through light blue curtains. Carol prepared the room carefully. No harsh lighting, no mirrors, no unexpected sounds. Just a bed with a soft quilt, a dresser, a chair by the window, and a small lamp that hummed softly when turned on. Natalie stepped inside and paused. The space felt foreign, not because it wasn't familiar, but because she didn't recognize the version of herself who once found rooms like this comforting. Her mother watched her with a hopeful smile. "We can change anything you need." Natalie shook her head. "It's okay, it just doesn't feel like mine yet." That was the hardest part of coming home. Nothing felt like hers. Dr. Benjamin Shaw continued their sessions twice a week, now in the living room or on the patio when Natalie felt safe enough to sit outside. He worked slowly, carefully, teaching her grounding techniques, ways to pull herself back when her mind slipped into the canyon. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Flashbacks struck at unpredictable times. A certain smell, a shift of wind, a scrape of fabric that sounded too much like footsteps on stone. Natalie would tense, her breath catching. Her eyes darted to corners as though expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. "He's gone," Carol would whisper, pulling her close. "He can't hurt you anymore." But Natalie's voice would tremble with truth. "He already did." Dr. Shaw reminded her that healing wasn't about erasing trauma. It was about learning to live alongside it without letting it consume her. Some days Natalie believed him. Other days she didn't. One of the first breakthroughs came unexpectedly. Natalie sat on the patio, tracing her fingers over the scars on her palm, the sky streaked with Arizona sunset. She spoke suddenly.
voice steady. He used to sit beside the shelter at night, just sit there, watching the sky. He'd say the world was too loud for people like us. People like you? Dr. Shaw asked gently. Natalie nodded. He thought we were the same. He said I didn't belong in the noise, that I was made for quiet. Her breath hitched. She looked up. He said he was the only one who understood me. But then her expression changed, sharpened, like someone waking from a dream. And I believed him, she whispered. For a while, I believed him. Dr. Shaw leaned forward. Natalie, he isolated you, broke your sense of reality. It wasn't consent, it wasn't choice, it was survival. Tears slipped down her face, but she nodded, not in weakness, but in recognition. Melissa Vance visited only on weekends. She always brought something small, chamomile tea, a soft blanket, a plant for Natalie's windowsill. But every time she stepped into the house, guilt twisted in her eyes. Natalie tried to ease it. None of this is your fault, she told her, but Melissa shook her head. I should have insisted on going with you, or called earlier, or… Melissa, Natalie interrupted gently. Keller knew what he was doing. If it wasn't that day, he would have watched and waited for another. Those words stayed with Melissa for months. Some pain didn't have a place to go, it just lived inside you. By spring 2019, almost a year after being found, Natalie made a decision that startled everyone. I want to go back, she said one morning at breakfast. Carol froze mid-step. Back? Where? The trailhead, Natalie answered quietly. Not the canyon, not the place he took me, just where the hike began. Carol's eyes filled instantly. Sweetheart, you don't have to. I know, Natalie swallowed. I need to. Dr. Shaw didn't oppose it, but he prepared her carefully. This won't be about conquering the past, he said. It will be about facing what remains of it. So, on a clear April morning, Natalie, Carol, Melissa, and Dr. Shaw drove north. The red rocks appeared slowly, like a landscape remembering itself. Natalie leaned her forehead against the window, watching the earth shift from city to desert to canyon. When they arrived at the trailhead, Natalie stepped out of the car and inhaled sharply. The air smelled the same. Warm earth, juniper, sun-baked stone. But she wasn't the same. Her heart hammered, her palms sweated, but her feet moved, one small step, then another, toward the path she once walked with easy confidence. Carol stood beside her, gently touching her elbow. Melissa and Dr. Shaw gave them space, trailing a few steps behind. Natalie moved down the trail, her breath quickening with each step. The first quarter mile felt endless, every curve a shadow of something she once loved, now braided with fear. At a flat rock overlooking the canyon, she stopped. The sunlight flickered across her face. Her hands trembled. This is far enough, she whispered. Carol nodded. Whenever you're ready. Natalie turned and looked back toward the trailhead. The car was small in the distance. The world was quiet. It doesn't feel like a place that tried to kill me, she said softly. Just a place I wasn't ready to come back to. And now? Dr. Shaw asked. Natalie exhaled slowly. Now I'm choosing to leave it. They walked back to the car together. This time, the trail felt shorter. Sometimes survival wasn't heroic. Sometimes it was simply deciding to keep moving. The months that followed were slow and uneven, but they were hers. Natalie began rebuilding piece by piece. She enrolled in online courses to recertify her teaching license. The lessons were exhausting at first. Concentration felt slippery, like trying to hold water in your hands. But she pressed on, even through the days when she had to reread the same paragraph 5 times. Then came volunteering, a nonprofit supporting survivors of abduction and long-term trauma, asked if she would speak to a small group, anonymously at first. Natalie agreed, voice shaking as she shared pieces of her story. To her surprise, it helped. Not erase, not heal completely, but connect. And connection was something she hadn't felt in years. Her confidence grew slowly, like a plant stretching towards sunlight after too long in the dark. She reclaimed friendships she thought she'd lost. She learned to manage triggers, noise, shadows, silence, wide-open spaces, rather than fear them. And astonishingly, she laughed again. Really laughed. The sound was rough at first, uncertain, like relearning a forgotten language, but her smile stayed longer each time. On the 5th anniversary of the day she was found, Natalie gathered the people who had carried her through the darkest years of her life. Dr. Shaw, Detective Torres, Melissa, Marcus Chen, and Diana Ortega, the rangers who found her beneath that juniper tree. And Carol, always Carol. Standing in her mother's living room, Natalie looked at all of them through grateful, tear-bright eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." Her voice wavered, but her smile stayed. "You helped me remember who I was before the canyon and helped me become someone stronger afterwards." Carol wrapped her arms around her daughter, tears falling freely. "You came home, and that's everything." As the evening faded into warm conversation and quiet understanding, Natalie slipped to the window, looking out at the night sky. For the first time in years, she felt something she thought she'd lost forever. A future. And for the first time, she wanted it. By the year 2023, 5 years after being found beneath a juniper tree that should have been her grave, Natalie Holloway was living alone again. Not in fear, not in isolation, but in a small, sunlit apartment in Tempe, where the walls were painted sage green and plants lined the window ledges like quiet companions. The space was hers in a way she didn't think anything ever could be again. Her morning routine returned in small, fragile steps. She made tea, watered her plants, opened the blinds to let the desert sun warm the room. Some mornings she felt steady. Others, she sat at the edge of her bed, breathing through a panic that rose without warning. But even on those days, she got up. That was the difference now. Natalie was no longer surviving in the ruins of what happened. She was living. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably living. She taught part-time at a charter school for students with learning differences. The first time she stepped into a classroom again, her hands trembled around her lesson plan. The hum of voices made her chest tighten. But then one student, a shy girl with thick glasses, asked Natalie a question about a book they were reading. Natalie's instinctive warmth returned, like a match striking in the dark. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. After months working with a nonprofit for trauma survivors, Natalie wrote an essay for a small literary journal. She used a pseudonym at first. She wasn't ready to expose her name to a world that had followed her disappearance like a headline. But the piece wasn't about Keller. It wasn't about the captivity. It wasn't about the wilderness or the tally marks on that cave wall. It was about survival. What it really meant, the difference between being found and coming back, how trauma didn't simply end the moment someone was rescued. It echoed, reshaped, demanded slow rebuilding. The essay reached people. Survivors of all kinds wrote to her, people who had endured captivity, people who had survived abusive relationships, people who had endured years of silence no one else recognized. Natalie answered as many as she could. She saw herself in their words, and for the first time, she didn't feel alone in her experience. That, more than anything, strengthened her. On a quiet afternoon that fall, Natalie made a decision she had been circling for months. She returned to Sedona. Alone. She told Carol exactly where she was going, promised to check in hourly, but she needed to do this step by herself. needed to understand whether the wilderness still owned a part of her, or whether she could reclaim it. The drive through Oak Creek Canyon was warm, the leaves just starting to shift into autumn colors. Sunlight flickered through the branches, scattering gold across the road. Natalie's hands gripped the steering wheel, tension coiling her spine, but she kept going.
At the trailhead, she parked in the same gravel lot where her car had once sat untouched for weeks. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, but she pushed the door open and stepped into the familiar desert heat. She walked slowly down the trail, inhaling deeply as the scent of juniper and warm stone rose around her. The path wasn't haunted the way she feared. It wasn't tainted by memory. It was just a trail, just earth and rock and sunlight. She made it about a mile in before she stopped. The canyon opened before her in shades of red and gold, the same colors she had admired years ago, back when she'd felt peace instead of fear. Natalie sat on a flat rock and let the silence wash over her. This silence was different from the one Keller had forced on her. This silence was alive, filled with wind and warmth and possibility. The canyon wasn't a prison. It never had been. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since the day she disappeared, she allowed herself to imagine the future without feeling like she was trespassing in her own life. When she stood and began walking back to the trailhead, she didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't need to. There was nothing behind her she hadn't already survived. Years continued to soften some of the jagged edges. Not all. Some scars stayed sharp. Triggers still crept in, shadows still sometimes shifted in ways that made her heart jump. But she no longer spiraled into fear without a way out. She had tools, she had connections, she had herself. On the 5th anniversary of her rescue, Carol hosted another gathering, smaller this time, more intimate. The living room glowed with warm lamps and soft murmurs of conversation. People who had carried Natalie through the darkest months filled the room. Melissa, Dr. Shaw, Detective Torres, and the 2 park rangers, Marcus Chen and Diana Ortega, who had brought her back into the world. Natalie stood in the center, feeling the weight of 5 years and the lightness of 5 years all at once. "I used to think the wilderness took something from me," she said, voice steady. Everyone fell silent. "Something I could never get back." She paused, breathing slowly as she met each pair of eyes. But the truth is, the wilderness didn't take anything. A person did, and he's gone. The wilderness is still here, and so am I. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. Natalie continued, "I spent a long time being afraid of silence, being afraid of being alone, being afraid of remembering. But I realized something. Fear only grows in the dark. When you bring it into the light, it loses its shape." She smiled softly. "I'm not who I was before I disappeared. I'll never be that person again. But I'm not who he tried to make me either." Her voice strengthened. "I'm someone new, and I'm still becoming." Melissa took her hand. Carol wrapped an arm around her. Dr. Shaw nodded approvingly. Torres, who had seen too many endings without resolution, felt something lift from his chest for the first time in years. Natalie excused herself and wandered to the window. Outside, the Arizona night stretched quiet and peaceful, dotted with distant porch lights and the faint glow of the city beyond. Carol joined her a moment later. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. Natalie exhaled, long and slow. "I think I'm finally ready to start living without always looking back." Her mother smiled through tears. "And what does that look like for you?" Natalie watched a shooting star streak faintly across the horizon. "Something different. Something mine." Then, after a quiet moment, she added something that surprised even her. "I hope he found whatever peace he was chasing, not because I forgive him, but because I don't want to carry him anymore." Carol's hand tightened around hers, eyes shining. "That," she said softly, "is what strength looks like." Months later, on a crisp October morning, Natalie left her apartment for a hike on a small, open, well-traveled trail near Tempe. She never hiked alone in remote places now, but she didn't fear the open sky anymore. She stepped onto the path, sunlight warming her shoulders. People passed, joggers, dog walkers, families. The air was alive with murmurs, laughter, footsteps. Not silence,
not the wilderness that once swallowed years of her life, but a trail that led forward, not back. Natalie looked ahead, breathed deeply, and kept walking, one step, then another. A survivor, a woman reclaimed, a life rebuilt from the dust of a desert that once held her captive. The trail curved toward the horizon, and Natalie followed it with steady, quiet courage. She didn't look behind her. She had no reason to. The wilderness was behind her now, and ahead was the rest of her life.